The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing, and addresses the assessment standards that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning in poetry. Learners should be able to recognize that verse and stanza forms, rhyme, rhythm, and punctuation affect meaning.
That says absolutely nothing about me.
Indeed, that says absolutely nothing about us. Hello everyone, my name is Nkele Mutsumi, and in this lesson series, we're discussing poetry. A lot of people think that the only place it lives in is in the library, covered in dust, and that it is all about some boring, old dead guy going on and on about flowers and clouds 200 years ago. So instead, I want you to think back to a time when you were really sad, angry, or a moment when you really felt alive. On one of these occasions, there was probably a song that seemed it had been written just for you. That somehow the words were perfect to describe exactly how you were feeling, and that is the soul of poetry. And today, just like hundreds of years ago, the art of poetry can be defined as any emotional language that appeals to the imagination. But to appreciate it, we need to understand how it works. What are the tools that poets use to get our imagination and emotions working? In this lesson, we're going to have a look at the first technique, which is rhyme. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to define rhyme and discuss how the meaning of a poem is affected by rhyme. But as I said earlier, poetry is not all about the past. We managed to catch up with one of the contemporary poets, Lebo Mashile. Let's see what she had to say.
My emergence, I guess, as a poet in the public space has been through performance, you know. I write a lot of poetry that translates well to an audience on a stage, you know, with me standing on a stage and delivering this poetry. It's very musical, it's very theatric, it's performance is a huge part of it, you know. I think one of the saddest misconceptions about poetry is the fact that, you know, it's this thing, this white European thing, these old dead white men in the pages of dusty books. And I understand where it comes from. It comes from the way that we were taught poetry. It comes from the kind of poetry that we were taught, you know. We weren't taught things that were relevant to us, to our lives. And the reality is that poetry has always been an essential part of our culture, you know, as African people. It's the way in which our values, our philosophy, our identity, our stories are told and are passed on, you know? But in many ways, I'm very similar to traditional poets, you know? Whether you're looking at Shakespeare or whether you're looking at an African traditional poet. I think that poetry that speaks to me, the old school poetry that speaks to me, is stuff that it's genuine, it's stuff that articulates the issues of its time, you know? I use my influences to speak about to speak about the things that are affecting my generation, you know? And maybe the differences between me and the older poets are more about time, but I don't think they're about purpose. I think our purposes are the same. I have been deeply influenced by music, hip-hop in particular. So rhyme is a common tool that I use, you know, because it makes the words sound more interesting. It makes the meaning more accessible to an audience, you know. It makes it more interesting to read on the page. Yeah.
That is absolutely correct. Poetry is real and very, very relevant in our lives. What exactly do we mean by rhyme? Let's recap what we discussed in grade 10. If two words have a very similar sound, we say that they rhyme. Now, let's look at some of the words that have a similar sound. Cat, mat, ret, set, fat, and hat. All these words end with the same sound, at. Here's another group of words. Try and spot what the common sound is. Skip, trip, whip, hip, flip, and sip. Did you recognize a similar sound? If you said ip, you would be 100% correct. From looking at these words, it would seem that rhyming is pretty easy, but what if the poet wants to use longer or more complicated words? To understand how rhyme works, we need to get to know about syllables and how they function. A syllable is a word or part of a word that has only one vowel sound. Think about syllables like bricks of sounds that build a word. Let's look at a word with one syllable. Red, green, and blue. So, a word with two syllables will have two sounds. For example, yellow, orange, and purple. If a word has three syllables, it will have three sounds, like hospital and photograph. Take a moment to think about your name. How many syllables does it have in it? What about the name of your school? When we want to find out whether words rhyme, we need to look at their final syllable, the syllables at the end of the word. We say that words rhyme if the syllables have the same sound patterns. Look at these words. Pillow and swallow. Here we can see that the first syllables have different sounds, but the second syllables in each word rhyme with each other. Now, if we look at these words, we notice that both syllables rhyme. Culture and vowel. Now for both of these words, you've got kal rhyming with the vowel in another word and cha with the cha in another word. That makes life a bit more difficult, doesn't it? If you as the writer can get both syllables of the words to rhyme, it is called a double rhyme. Now, look at these words and say which words rhyme with each other. Phone, one, sun, one, grown, hone, done, gone, bone, none, and stone. The words that rhyme are phone, grown, hone, bone, and stone, and one, sun, one, done, none. Gone is all by itself. It doesn't rhyme with anything. Did you notice that not all words that look similar sound similar? These three words look like they should sound the same, but in fact, they are very different. Gone, one, and phone. So it really helps to find if you read the poem aloud and listen to the sounds to find the rhyme and pattern. Do you now have a good idea of what we mean by rhyme? Let's recap what we said. If two words have a very similar sound, we say that they rhyme. Let's look at some poetry that has rhyme. Mbongeni Khumalo is the author of this poem called Mad Poem 16. This poem is about the role of the poet in poetry in society. And like we saw at the beginning of the lesson, poetry is about the energy and the reality of the present. Listen to this poem and you'll see what I mean.
I'm simple in my complexity, complex in my simplicity. I rush through your mental doors, breaking all grammatical laws, making use of my rebellion, striking it rich, making a million. Now I've become a philosopher, walking on the footsteps of Christopher, spending sleepless nights every day, doing all this to get my pay.
Wow, and that was just the first part of the poem. There's a lot more where that came from. What do you notice about the words at the end of the lines? I'm simple in my complexity, complex in my simplicity. The first two lines end with the words complexity and simplicity. The second two lines are, I rush through your mental doors, breaking all grammatical laws. The second two lines end with the words doors and laws. The third two lines are, making use of my rebellion, striking it rich, making a million. Thus they end with the words rebellion and million. The fourth two lines are, now I've become a philosopher, walking on the footsteps of Christopher. They end with the words philosopher and Christopher. And the last two lines end with the words every day and my pay. Now, your teacher might ask you to show the rhyme scheme of a poem. A rhyme scheme refers to the pattern of rhyming words in a poem. Think of the rhyme scheme like a map of the sound in the poem. You use patterns and maps in life every day with no problem, so a rhyme scheme is nothing to worry about. How do you show a rhyme scheme? You can't write out the last word of every line in the poem, especially if the poem is very long. There has to be a simpler way. This is how you should do it. You use the alphabet A, B, C, D, and so on. The first rhyming sound at the end of the first line is called A. And all the words which rhyme with the sound are also called A. The next rhyming sound will be B. And all the words which rhyme with it will also be called B. Let's see how this works in practice by looking again at Mbongeni Khumalo's Mad Poem 16.
I'm simple in my complexity, complex in my simplicity. I rush through your mental doors, breaking all grammatical laws, making use of my rebellion, striking it rich, making a million. Now I've become a philosopher, walking on the footsteps of Christopher, spending sleepless nights every day, doing all this to get my pay.
We saw that complexity and simplicity have similar sounds A. In other words, they rhyme. So let's call them A. The second two lines end with the words doors and laws. So we call these rhyming sounds B. The third two lines end with rebellion and million. Therefore, we'll call these C. The fourth two lines end with the words philosopher and Christopher. They therefore have to become D. How does our rhyme scheme look so far? A, B, and B, C, C, D, and D, and E, E. Is that all we have to do? Just find the rhyme scheme of a poem? No. We also have to say how we think the rhyme scheme adds to the meaning of the poem. The best thing to do, look at the words that rhyme and see if they're important to the meaning of the poem. When we look at a poem for analysis, it is almost like being a detective looking for clues in a mystery, except in our case, the mystery is a nice one and we're trying to work out what the poet is saying. The first clue we get in this poem comes from the rhyme scheme. It divides the poem into sections or themes for us. The first two lines tell us about the poet, that he is just a simple man, but with complicated feelings and thoughts that can't just be said in a straightforward manner. I think that this is true for most of us, and in a way, it is also true this poem and for the poetry and life in general. The second idea the poet presents is that poetry has the power to change our minds and open us up to new ideas, breaking the rules of how we communicate. The next idea deals with how poetry can be art and part of our world of ideas. But at the same time, the poet is still a man living in the real world, and he needs money to survive and has dreams about being rich and famous. These rhyming words compare the poet to a philosopher. This last pair of rhyming lines emphasizes that, like everyone else, the poet lives in the real world, and making poetry is his work. So you can see that the rhyme scheme sometimes gives us clues to what the poem is all about and helps us to understand what the poet is saying to us, his readers. We now know what rhyme is and how it is used in poetry to make the meaning of the words even clearer. Being able to find and discuss the rhyme scheme of a poem adds to your understanding of the techniques of poetry and the meaning of the poem. From me, Nkele Mutsumi, I'll see you in our next lesson when we examine rhythm. Goodbye.